Good afternoon, and welcome to this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the human rights implications of the state of exception in El Salvador, imposed last March by the government of President Nayib Bukele. On Saturday, March 26th, 62 people were murdered in El Salvador in an explosion of gang violence, 62 in a single day. 87 killings were recorded within 3 days. Faced with such a brutal rampage, any government would be under pressure to respond. The response of the Salvadoran government was to impose a draconian state of exception that has deepened and expanded El Salvador's pre-existing human rights and governance crisis. The state of exception, requested by President Bukele and approved by the Legislative Assembly, suspended the most basic civil and political rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of association and due process rights. Originally set for 30 days, it has been renewed 5 times and remains in effect today. As you will hear from our witnesses, more than 50,000 people have been rounded up and placed in preventive detentions since the state of exception began. That is an astounding number. I can think of no equivalent in Latin America, not even during the worst years of military dictatorship. It's a number that brings to mind Turkey under Erdogan, or Egypt under el-Sisi. Others supposedly democratic states whose elected leaders have turned sharply towards authoritarianism. Those detained are reported to have little to no access to counsel and are not informed of the charges or evidence against them. Hundreds of cases of torture, physical and verbal abuse, denial of food and medicine, and other abuses have been documented. At least 73 people have died. In 2021, the government fired the Attorney General and purged 5 Supreme Court judges, resulting in a judicial system that can no longer be viewed as independent. Mass trials were already a practice before the state of exception was put in place. Independent reporting on gangs and organized crime has been criminalized. Smear campaigns have been launched against journalists, and at least 9 have been forced to flee the country, including one of our witnesses today. In short, the government has responded to one kind of human rights crisis, the crisis of gang violence, by creating another, the dismantling of the rule of law. The state of exception has been widely criticized, including by Secretary of State Blinken, who urged the Salvadoran government to address the gang threat while also protecting vital civil liberties. But international expressions of concern have not worked to shift the calculus of the Bukele government. The U.S. has redirected some foreign assistance away from the national police and towards civil society. Some targeted sanctions have been imposed, including some designations under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. But only a couple of the sanctions are directly related to the state of exception. More people have been sanctioned for negotiating with gangs than for undermining democracy. U.S. bilateral cooperation is continuing in many areas, including counter-narcotics. I was struck by the assertion in the 2021 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report that democratic backsliding has had limited impact on El Salvador's ability to act as a cooperative and willing partner for the United States in counter-narcotics efforts. I would have thought that gutting the rule of law, as Bukele has done systematically since taking office, would be an obvious blow to serious efforts to deal with El Salvador's entrenched gangs. So let me be clear. I welcome the actions that the Biden administration has taken in response to the situation in El Salvador. At the same time, I think the U.S. response needs to be stronger, more strategic and affirmative of human rights, both for El Salvador and throughout the Central American region. In country after country, leaders are consolidating their power at the expense of the future of their people, using the same tactics, changing the rules so authoritarian populists can stay in power, undermining the independence of the courts, buying loyalty with corruption, shutting down the space for civil society and opposition, imprisoning people. Each case is different, but the overall trend is devastatingly clear. The modest progress that has been made in reducing impunity and consolidating democratic governance is being systematically rolled back. The objective of this hearing is to think together about what more can be done. instructions to multilateral institutions, review of governance clauses in trade agreements, increased financial and political support for accountability at the regional and international level, travel warnings, audits of aid and loans, multilateral coordination. All these ideas need to be on the table. This is an emergency. Finally, to those who counter criticism of the Salvadoran government by saying that President Bukele's actions are popular and that his approval ratings are high, let me just say that popular doesn't equal right. The Salvadoran state has obligations under international human rights law with which it is not complying. All states in the international community have a responsibility to insist on compliance. I've been deeply engaged in El Salvador and U.S. policy towards El Salvador since 1983. I've regularly traveled there and have developed enduring relationships that span the political spectrum and extend way beyond the capital. On many occasions, I've met individuals and families who are victims of gang violence. According to government reporting, homicides have gone down significantly during the state of exception. But it's less clear what is happening with disappearances and extortion. Several mass graves have been found since 2019. I've heard from families who are afraid to let their sons and daughters go outside for fear that they would be forcibly recruited or killed by gangs. Many are now afraid to have them go to the store out of fear that they'll be swept up and imprisoned by the police or the military. Look, throughout my career, I've focused on the rights and well-being of the Salvadoran people, especially victims of violence. I've supported human rights in El Salvador for as long as I've worked in Congress, because I believe every Salvadoran deserves to live in dignity and because it's the right thing to do. Popularity is not the guidepost. So let me close by congratulating Carlos Dada, editor-in-chief and co-founder of the pioneering online news site El Faro, on receiving the International Press Institute's World Press Freedom Hero Award on September 9th. The award recognizes that Mr. Dada has faced extraordinary pressure from the government and criminal organizations, including being a victim of Pegasus spyware surveillance. I welcome this well-deserved recognition, but it also saddens me because it is one more indicator that the promise of the peace accord signed 30 years ago is eroding. And with that, I'm happy to turn this over to Co-Chair Smith. If I don't, I'm going to just make sure he's not on the.
He's not going to join us.
Co-Chair Smith is going to share a statement will be part of the record. But at this point, let me introduce our first panel. Emily Mandrala currently serves as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Previously, she was the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas, promoting U.S. policies of engagement toward the Americas from 2017 to 2021. Her prior government service includes serving as a Director for Legislative Affairs in the National Security Council, working at the Department of State as a Special Advisor to the Coordinator for Cuban Affairs, and serving as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She has an MA in International Economics from Johns Hopkins of Advanced International Studies and a BA in Mathematics from the University of Virginia. Our second witness will be Scott Busby, who serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. His prior positions include serving as Director for Human Rights on the National Security Council in the White House, Coordinator of the Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration, Asylum, and Refugees in Geneva, Switzerland, Director of the Office of Policy and Resource Planning at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration in the Department of State, Director for Multilateral and Humanitarian Affairs at the National Security Council, and Counsel for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He got his start in the federal service as an asylum officer at INS. Scott holds advanced degrees in sociology and law from the University of California in Berkeley and received his BA from Amherst College. I will begin with Ms. Mandrala. You are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Co-chairs McGovern and Smith, distinguished members of the Commission, I welcome the opportunity to testify today regarding the ongoing state of exception in El Salvador. As you are already aware, El Salvador has a long history of gang violence, and gang activity has a strong presence in El Salvador and the United States. The Salvadoran Legislative Assembly on March 27th declared a state of exception in response to a spate of 62 murders over a 24-hour period on March 26th. The original 30-day decree has since been extended 5 times, with Minister of Justice and Security Villatoro announcing a forthcoming wave of reforms aimed at preventing the release of gang members arrested during the emergency regime. The government of El Salvador credits the state of exception with reducing the number of reported violent crimes in the country. The Department of State has expressed its concerns that the declaration drastically curtails civil rights protections under the laws of El Salvador. The declaration and its subsequent extensions suspend the freedom of association, the right to be immediately informed of the reason for detention, the right to have a defense attorney during initial investigations, and the right to private communication. It also extends administrative detentions from 3 to 15 days and removes the right to bail for any gang-related offense. The Legislative Assembly also amended the Penal Code, lowering the age of criminal responsibility to 12 years of age, and increased prison sentences for gang members from a maximum of 5 years to a maximum of 45 years. The most recent extension of the state of exception removed the restrictions on freedom of association. The Legislative Assembly separately passed legislation criminalizing reporting on gang activities. While the department remains unaware of any members of the media arrested pursuant to this gang reporting law, reporters indicate undue pressure to refrain from reporting facts about the state of exception. Several members of the media have also fled the country, citing fear of reprisal from the government. To date, over 51,000 individuals have been detained during the declared emergency. Presiding judges have released roughly 700 of those detained, citing lack of evidence of gang involvement. Government officials have acknowledged publicly that some of the individuals have been mistakenly jailed, but said they had a plan to free what they claim are a small percentage of innocent detainees. The department remains resolutely committed to combating transnational organized crime. However, some of the measures taken during the state of exception run counter to established human rights standards and are unsustainable from a practical perspective. On April 10th, Secretary Blinken urged via Twitter the government of El Salvador to uphold due process and protect civil liberties, including freedoms of press, peaceful assembly, and expression. During private interactions with the government of El Salvador, the department has likewise underscored the importance of respecting human rights, including fair trial guarantees. Many civil society organizations, NGOs, and attorneys in El Salvador also decry the broad roundup as government overreach, citing numerous reports of human rights violations and deaths stemming from alleged arbitrary detentions and overcrowded prisons. One prominent NGO has recorded more than 2,600 reports of arbitrary arrest during the state of exception. In order to truly dismantle organized crime in El Salvador and effect tangible change for years to come, a sustainable approach is needed. Real and sustainable security and prosperity comes through the rule of law. In a democracy, all those accused of crimes should face a transparent system of justice. The government of El Salvador would need to take extraordinary pains to ensure each individual is afforded access to a defense and a fair trial. We appreciate the Commission's attentiveness to events in El Salvador. As we move forward, the department asks for broad bipartisan congressional support in combating transnational violence in Latin America and the Caribbean in a sustainable, ethical, and democratic manner. Co-chairs McGovern and Smith, members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Busby.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, and thank you to Co-Chairman Smith as well as distinguished members of the Commission for the opportunity to testify today about the human rights climate in El Salvador, specifically regarding our concerns about the state of exception. The Salvadoran government's primary justification for the state of exception is the threat posed by gang violence. Certainly, gang violence is an understandable and immediate concern of the Salvadoran people and threatens the national security and prosperity of El Salvador, its immediate neighbors, and the United States. We agree that the problem needs to be urgently and comprehensively addressed. However, while the state of exception may address short-term goals, as Das Mandrala has noted, we are concerned that it will not provide a lasting solution to El Salvador's gang violence problem. If it continues, we anticipate lasting impacts on human rights and the rule of law. El Salvador's security forces are patrolling working-class communities and arresting thousands of alleged gang members and gang collaborators. Soldiers and police officers have erected an extensive network of checkpoints at roads and highways, inspected public transport buses, and entered poor neighborhoods in search of suspected gang members. According to the government of El Salvador, since the state of exception was first imposed, security forces have arrested more than 51,000 people. We understand this includes 1,979 minors for allegedly belonging to or collaborating with gangs. But residents and rights groups say there have been arbitrary arrests of young people from impoverished communities for having tattoos, carrying cash, or protesting the detention of relatives who have not been brought before a judge. In addition, according to Amnesty International, since the start of the state of exception, at least 73 people have died in police custody as of August 31st. Those arrested are placed in overcrowded and violent prisons. Although over 700 individuals have been released, the rest remain detained, awaiting court proceedings. Some 16,000 imprisoned gang members have also been confined to their cells 24 hours a day and have had their food reduced to 2 meals a day. Salvadoran officials have publicly acknowledged that some innocent people may have been arrested during the state of exception, but officials claim it is a very small percentage and say they will review cases and release innocent detainees expeditiously. That said, very few detainees have been released to date, which suggests that any current mechanism for review is either not working or working too slowly to be effective. State of exception has also created an enabling environment for other concerning legislation. On April the 5th, the Legislative Assembly passed, with no debate or discussion, changes to the criminal code criminalizing reporting on certain gang activities. The legislation establishes penalties of 10 to 15 years in prison for those who, quote, reproduce and transmit messages or communications, close quote, attributed to criminal groups or gangs. We are not aware of any journalists being arrested under this law, but the legislation opens the door to prosecution or possibly other political harassment of reporters or outlets covering gang issues, which has had a chilling effect. Many civil society organizations have expressed grave concerns over the government of El Salvador's actions under the state of exception, citing abuse of power, excessive use of force by police officers, and harassment and digital surveillance of journalists and human rights defenders. Local civil society organizations are engaging in self-censorship and becoming more cautious of conducting public activities. Fear of retribution is increasing for advocating for human rights or expressing opposition to actions taken by the government. The contraction of civic space in Central America also threatens regional stability, prosperity, and security. Accordingly, civil society organizations have underlined the importance of public and private statements from the international community and access to international human rights bodies to provide protection for human rights defenders and accountability for human rights violations and abuses. Together with our interagency partners, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor is carrying out the U.S. commitment to protecting, defending, and promoting civic space in Central America, including through the recently announced Voices Initiative, as well as ongoing programs. The Voices Initiative will promote freedoms of association and peaceful assembly, strengthen independent media, and protect civic actors and human rights defenders. We remain committed to working with El Salvador to address legitimate security concerns while also respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both. I just have a few questions. Ms. Mandrala, how does the State Department evaluate the measures that have been taken to date to encourage the Bukele government to respect its human rights obligations? And if you could tell us, I mean, are there what additional measures might be under consideration, and are more sanctions in the work?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. The State Department is, and the U.S. government writ large, at the direction of President Biden, has combating corruption as one of its chief priorities around the world. President Biden has said that corruption is a threat to U.S. national security, and he has directed us to put in place measures that span the spectrum to combat corruption around the world. In Central America, we work closely with like-minded partners. We work through the use of tools that Congress has given us, sanctions-related tools, but also our diplomacy, engaging with governments directly, engaging with civil society organizations. Busby spoke about the Voices Initiative that's designed to protect, preserve, and grow civic space, transparency in Central America. And we are working across each of those initiatives to protect rule of law, to advance democracy in Central America and in El Salvador as well. Specific to sanctions, we have used tools that Congress has given us, the Global Magnitsky Act, also the Section 353 Corrupt and Undemocratic Actors List, to identify actors that are engaged in acts of corruption or stymieing investigations into corruption, to identify them for sanctions, to withdraw visas, and in the case of Global Magnitsky, to target their assets as well, to indicate U.S. concern about involvement in corruption.
You know, El Salvador has an $800 million bond payment due to the IMF in January of 2023 and another due in 2025. What are the prospects that these payments will actually be met? What instructions have been given to U.S. representatives in international financial institutions when it comes to any conditioning of financial relief to El Salvador?
Thank you for that question. As for the prospects, recent press reporting indicates that the government of El Salvador feels as though it's in a position to meet the bond repayment in January of next year. It's an issue that we are following closely and analyzing, talking to civil society organizations and independent monitors as well. We are committed to El Salvador's economic well-being, but we recognize that economic well-being in the long term is predicated on its resilience. It must be sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And are watching the situation very closely, and recognize that there are some key dates in the near future that you just indicated that could have impact on the people of El Salvador and their well-being.
So the State Department has issued a level 3 travel advisory for El Salvador, which means that people should reconsider travel, essentially. Just for the record, what criteria went into making that recommendation?
As I understand, the travel warning level 3 specifically references crime and COVID rates for the level 3 determination. In addition, the embassy issued a security alert to U.S. citizens on March 30th to inform them of the emergency decree, the state of exception. And we advise U.S. citizens in El Salvador to monitor local news for more information, to follow all published legal guidance, and to enroll in the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program at step.state.gov to receive the latest from the embassy with respect to the state of exception and otherwise.
Mr. Busby, reports on the number of people detained under the state of exception, the number of minors, et cetera, vary from source to source. So how is state documenting this information? Are embassy officials able to visit prisons? Do you have the level of access that you need?
Thanks for the question, Chairman McGovern. We're very reliant on government statistics for this data. The number's a large one, and it has been challenging for us to monitor the folks who are held in lots of different places. So we're primarily reliant on government reports when it comes to the total number of detainees.
In your testimony, you mentioned the Voices Initiative. Can you say a little bit more about that initiative? How is it designed? How is it supposed to work?
So the Voices Initiative is a $42 million US program developed to protect, defend, and promote civic space in Central America. The program aims at promoting freedom of expression and strengthening independent media, countering criminalization, providing protection, promoting digital democracy, and countering digital authoritarianism. Funding allows like-minded partners to continue advocating for the protection of internationally recognized human rights. Together with our interagency partners, DRL is actively highlighting the department's commitment to safeguarding civic space in Central America through the Voices Initiative. The contraction of civic space is a direct threat to regional stability, prosperity, and security. And we will continue to mobilize diplomatic tools and plan to dedicate foreign assistance resources to address the full range of challenges described above, in coordination and collaboration with others committed to the goals of the Voices Initiative.
Yeah, no, and yet, as we're meeting here today, we have members of the press that feel compelled to flee El Salvador. A lot of people who are active in civil society don't feel that they can say what they believe or say anything in El Salvador right now for fear that they'll be targeted by the government. I think the trend is moving in a direction where the only way to help protect independent voices is for them to leave the country, essentially. So I've talked to a lot of people that I've known in El Salvador for many, many years who say that every time that there is something published or something referenced that is contrary to what the government might be spouting, they become the targets of these social media campaigns. They get threats. Their families are being threatened, and I guess this reminds me of the way a lot of the stories that I heard when I was in El Salvador in 1983 and 1984, and when the war was going on. And so I think it's a very, very disturbing trend.
We share the concern, Congressman, and we do, through our emergency programs, we are assisting those individuals and groups who are under threat. Things like the Voices Initiative
Right.
obviously take time to have an impact.
Right.
So, but we'll continue to stay in close contact with
Right.
these activists and civil society, as well as independent journalists, to try to give them as much protection as we possibly can.
Impunity is a persistent problem in El Salvador. We've seen some multilateral coordination when it comes to accountability for grave human rights violations in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. So to what extent has there been multilateral coordination in defining and implementing the administration's policy toward El Salvador more generally? And specifically, is there ongoing coordination when it comes to accountability for any international crimes committed in El Salvador?
I'll start and Emily can add. We have coordinated with like-minded partners and allies on communicating concerns to the Bukele government, including around human rights, transparency, and rule of law. And I would note the government has demonstrated a willingness to listen to these concerns that we have mostly expressed in private. I would note that the government did make a small but important change in the last extension of the state of exception, by restoring the right to freedom of association. So we will continue to talk to like-minded partners. I would note that we've done so through the Community of Democracies, which the U.S. is a very active part of, and will do so through other mechanisms as appropriate.
I know, Ms. Mandrala, I don't know if you want to add anything or.
Sure. We do a little bit of additional information about how we coordinate it with like-minded countries. We do so through the Community of Democracies. We also engage regularly in Washington, embassies of like-minded countries, and also through capitals on issues of mutual concern, mutual interest. There's a lot of interest in Central America writ large and ways that we can coordinate with like-minded countries our policies. And I will also note that the Treasury Department earlier this year did a sanctions review that determined that our sanctions are more effective. And this is something that many of us know, that our sanctions are more effective when conducted multilaterally. And so we are regularly in touch with partners around the world to explain to them the approach that we've taken under the 353 list, Global Magnitsky, and others to encourage a multilateral approach.
Thank you. Mr. Busby, I'm deeply, obviously concerned about the current situation and what appears to be a dramatic erosion of basic civil and human rights in El Salvador. But I also believe that resolving some of these past cases, these historic cases, are incredibly important. Again, it's especially when tackling the issue of impunity. And I've traveled to El Mozote. That was the scene of one of the worst massacres that we've ever seen in the region. And there's a case that's been opened up, and we're trying to get some accountability and some closure here, if you will, and some peace of mind for the families of the victims. I don't know whether or not there's any update on accountability in that particular case. I know that we've been working with this administration to try to make sure that any relevant information that we have is made available for those who are taking this case on. But I visited that site several years ago, and with my daughter, and we heard the stories, and we saw the names of people that were massacred, mostly women and children, but some children so young that when they wrote the age, it was 0. But it seems to me that that's one of these defining cases. And by the way, I should tell you that when I traveled to El Salvador with Speaker Pelosi, this was right. I think when the year Bukele first got elected president, we had a very candid conversation with him about this issue, and he promised to do everything he could and move heaven and earth to make sure that all the records were available and that justice would be done in this case. To say that his words ring hollow now is an understatement. But I don't know whether you would like to comment, or Ms. Mandrala, either one on any updates on this case.
Well, thanks for your interest, Chairman McGovern, and thank you for your longstanding interest in Salvadoran issues. I was a college student around the time that El Mozote happened, and I too remember it from those years. As you know, I think the former judge in the case did ask for our help in turning over any additional documents we might have relating to that case. And we've now done so in 2 tranches. The most recent tranche we turned over to the court in July. So we're doing our best to give the court and the new judge now on the case as much information as we possibly can on the case. And the case, as we understand it, is proceeding.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate this administration's willingness to provide information, because to me this is a case that is not just about El Salvador, it's also about the United States. Our country, our government at the time helped create the battalion that was responsible for this massacre. We trained many of the soldiers who were involved in that massacre. We also provided a lot of military assistance. And I remember when it happened, the sitting administration at the time publicly denied that the massacre happened. And we all know that not to be the case. And so I appreciate the Biden-Harris administration's willingness to do the right thing here. And I appreciate your efforts on this as well. Let me just ask one last question for both of you. And that is, with regard to the Democracy Summit. What specifically for El Salvador? What criteria will the administration be considering as preparations move forward for the next summit?
I'll start and as Mandrala can add. We've had to assess countries' democratic and human rights records in deciding who to include in the summit. And then in conjunction with the summit, we asked governments to make commitments, both domestic and foreign, when it comes to promoting democracy and human rights. We are now planning for the second summit sometime in early 2023. And our hope is that there will have been concrete steps undertaken by the governments participating in the summit by that time. I would note that the U.S. has also undertaken a number of commitments in conjunction with the summit, which we hope to deliver on at that time as well.
Ms. Mandrala, I don't know if you want to add anything.
The only thing I'll add is to underscore something the Secretary has said, especially as it relates to the region. In the speech he delivered in Quito in October of last year, really sought to, excuse me, to stress the importance of democracies in the hemisphere, to showcase that democracies can deliver for their people. And that's one of our chief policy priorities in the Western Hemisphere, is to work with strong democracies throughout the region and to specifically on ways that democracies can deliver for their people. And that'll be a key component of the Summit for Democracies, the second round as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I don't know if there's anything else that either of you want to add, but before I do, let me just kind of conclude at least my questioning by saying, look, as I said, I've been going to El Salvador and I've been involved in El Salvador since the early 1980s, I worked for a congressman from Boston, a guy named Joe Moakley, and helped investigate the murders of the Jesuit priests and their housekeeper and daughter at the University of Central America that occurred in 1989. A lot of people that I got to know over these years disappeared or were killed. Many were forced to flee the country during the war. And I had hoped that, after the war ended, that El Salvador would be on a pathway to not only a more peaceful future, but a future where issues like impunity would be dealt with head on, where democracy would be entrenched, where people's civil liberties and civil rights would be respected. And in the last couple of years, the conversations I've had with people that I have known for years have never sounded more concerned or desperate. I mean, a lot of my friends and organizations and people that I've met with over the years, have said to me when I've suggested, well, maybe I'll come down and we can see firsthand what's going on. We can have some conversations. Many of these individuals, many of these organizations are fearful of having any kind of a public encounter with a member of Congress who might not necessarily be in line with what the Bukele administration is saying. It is chilling, what is unfolding down there, and I get it. that, it's popular because the gang violence is out of control and people want that, dealt with. But there's a way to deal with it, and there's a way to not deal with it. And I really am, I'm very, very worried about El Salvador's future. And I'd like to think there's a way to be able to deal with things like gang violence and criminality, but not undercut and threaten the press, not target individuals who have a different opinion on how they might proceed. And to understand in a democracy, you have to hear from all sides. Believe me, I mean, I'm in Congress. I mean, I do town hall meetings, and I realize I'm not universally loved, but the bottom line is that that is what a democracy is about. That people get to express their viewpoints and sometimes be able to hold politicians to account when they're not doing the right thing. But I'm just worried that the backsliding on democracy is so dramatic and so severe uh, that it demands urgent attention, not just by the United States, but by the international community. And I appreciate again the focus of both of you and the Biden administration on human rights. I think that ought to be the centerpiece of our foreign policy. But and we're going to hear from our next panel, and I mean, I'm sure you'll see their testimonies and hear their testimonies, but. This is a very, very pivotal moment, I think. So I don't know, Mr. Busby and Ms. Mandrala, any last words, and then I'll let you go, but I figure I'll give you the last word.
Well, let me say, we share the concerns, Mr. Chair, and are doing our best to address them in conversations with senior members of the Bukele administration and in terms of our own policies. And we share your goal of addressing the legitimate security concerns of the Salvadoran people while ensuring respect for human rights and the rule of law. Emily?
And thank you, Chairman, for your attention to this important matter, and to many others in Congress that I know are paying very close attention and have issued statements. Some have traveled to El Salvador as well to engage directly with the government, with civil society organizations. We think it's incredibly important that Congress continues to pay attention to the issues that you've raised today on the Commission. So thank you.
Yeah. And again, I thank you both. And I just want to also say for the record, look, the future of El Salvador lies with the Salvadoran people. El Salvador is a sovereign country. But I think to the extent that, we are going to be a partner, and we can be supportive in terms of economic assistance and other assistance, or to help, coordinate other nations in an effort to help El Salvador's future. I think has to depend on, on a willingness to adhere to democratic principles, to basically continue to want to be a democracy, and to have a basic respect for human rights. And so that's the message. We can't control what happens in El Salvador. It's the Salvadoran people that do. But I will tell you, as somebody who has followed this country for many, many, many years, I was hoping that we'd be in a better place than we are right now. And so I thank you both very much, and you are free to go. So thank you. And now our second panel is Leonora Tiaga Rubio. She's a Salvadoran attorney. She heads the program on impunity and grave human rights violations at the Due Process of Law Foundation in Washington, D.C. And she is also a commissioner for the National Commission for the Search of Disappeared Persons, Buscada, in El Salvador, an ad hominem position at the Due Process of Law Foundation. Leonora heads research, advocacy, and monitoring initiatives on transitional justice issues and the current state of violence in Latin America. She's also served as Deputy Ombudsman for Children and Youth at the Ombudsman's Office in El Salvador, and has worked with different human rights organizations and victims groups on litigation, both at the national and at the international level. Noah Bullock has served as the Executive Director of Cristasol, a human rights organization with a presence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras since 2010. He first went to El Salvador in 2005 as a human rights intern for Cristasol after graduating from the University of Montana. Noah studied in 2001 at the International Institute for Conflict Resolution, a joint project of the University of Ulster, Northern Ireland, and the United Nations University. He graduated cum laude with a postgraduate certificate in local development from Jose Simon Cañas Central American University in 2009. Hector Silva Avalos is a Salvadoran journalist. He studied journalism at the Central American University in San Salvador and at the University of Barcelona. He worked as a reporter and editor at La Prensa Gráfica in El Salvador for 15 years and was an editor and senior researcher at the Insight Crime Foundation. He was a diplomat in Washington and a fellow at the Center for Latin American Studies at American University. In 2014, he wrote Infiltrated, Chronicle of Corruption in El Salvador National Police, and founded Revista Factum magazine. He has collaborated with several media outlets, El Pias of Spain, and the New York Times, among others. Tamara Tarasiuk Bronner joined Human Rights Watch as a fellow in 2005. She covered Mexico and Venezuela and has worked on several countries in the region as a senior researcher, as acting director, and currently as deputy director of Human Rights Watch's Americas Division. She previously was a junior scholar at the Latin American program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she coordinated a project on citizen security in Latin America and worked at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States. She was born in Venezuela and grew up in Argentina, where she studied law at Torquato de Tella University. Again, I apologize for my terrible Spanish. She has published articles in leading newspapers globally and holds a postgraduate diploma at Human Rights and Transitional Justice from the University of Chile and a master's degree in law from Columbia Law School. So I appreciate all of you being here today. Lenore, we'll begin with you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Congressman McGovern and distinguished members of the Commission. On behalf of the Due Process of Law Foundation, I thank you for the opportunity to report on the human rights crisis that has been taking place in El Salvador since the declaration of a state of emergency 168 days ago. This state of emergency is part of a pattern of growing authoritarian tendencies and deteriorating rule of law in El Salvador, as you stated earlier. It comes less than a year after President Nayib Bukele Nuevas Ideas political party took control of the Legislative Assembly, the Congress, the Salvadorian Congress, who quickly moved to fire all 5 magistrates of the Supreme Court Constitutional Chamber and the then Attorney General. The declared state of emergency, supposedly based on Article 29 of El Salvador Constitution, presents several legal problems. The first one is that it exceeds the maximum legal term, which is 60 days. The second one is that it does not comply with the permissible reasons for a state of emergency as provided for in the Constitution. The Constitution provides for a state of emergency, also called a regime of exception, as a temporary response to extraordinary circumstances that pose a threat to national security or in cases of war, catastrophe, or serious disturbances of public order. Although an increase in crime may be an emergency, and it is an emergency, it does not fit into any of those categories. The previous Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court of Justice interpreted that during circumstances such as a rise in crime, as the one that we saw on March, existing laws and established institutions should be sufficient to address the problem, unless the government proves otherwise, which thus far has not happened here. The third problematic feature of the Salvadorian state of emergency is the suspension of judicial guarantees, such as the presumption of innocence, the right to a defense, and the right not to self-incriminate, which, according to international law, cannot be suspended. In general, states of emergency are last resort mechanisms used by states to confront serious crises, through which extraordinary powers are granted, usually to the executive branch, and which allows for the temporary suspension of certain rights while abnormal conditions persist. However, the Latin American experience has shown that these regimes can easily become tools for the abuse of power, rather than functioning to get a critical situation under control. They work to control the political opposition or simply those whose opinions diverge from the executive or ruling party. This was the case, for example, in the states of emergency declared by Alberto Fujimori in the early 90s in Peru to supposedly combat terrorism during Peru's internal conflict. But beyond these issues with the letter of the law of the state of emergency decrees, the most problematic aspect of the ongoing emergency regime in El Salvador is the commission of widespread human rights abuses by authorities, including arbitrary detentions, tortures, and degraded treatment, illegal trespasses, and due process violation. As we all know, over 50,000 people have been detained since the state of emergency began, making El Salvador the country with the second largest incarcerated population per capita, second only by this country, the USA. Most of these detentions have been carried out by the national police and the military during large-scale raids without arrest warrants and even with false charges. And most of the victims are among El Salvador's most vulnerable, those who live in poverty and whose only crime is living in gang-controlled territories where they are easy targets for these raids. And according to the latest figures, 72 or maybe 73 people detained have also died in custody. To be clear, the current scenario is not a problem created exclusively by El Salvador executive branch. The Salvadorian judiciary has played a key role in facilitating these abuses, as we also saw it in the case of violations committed during the armed conflict. Especially as due process as the presumption of innocence have been virtually eliminated for those who have been detained under the state of exception. And prosecutors and many judges have not questioned or disapplied these legislations, these policies, even though they have the duty to do so. Following their arrest, many of the detainees are brought before judges in what we can call group hearings without any of the normal due process guarantees. Strategic legal reforms have also helped to facilitate harsher penalties and fewer protections for those who are detained. Reforms to the penal code and the special law against acts of terrorism put in place immediately following the first state of emergency declarations in March allowed expedited processes to prove gang participation, increased prison sentences for convicted gang members, and allowed children as young as 12 accused of gang membership to be tried as adults. What can be done? First, we think that we call for the immediate ratification of William Duncan's nominee as U.S. ambassador to El Salvador. Also, it's important that repeatedly and publicly the government of the U.S. government continue condemning future actions by President Bukele, the Salvadorian Legislative Assembly, and the Supreme Court that further propels the country toward terrorism. It's also important to continue issuing individual sanctions of those engaged in supporting authoritarian practices and corruption surrounded Bukele and his government, including people from the judiciary. And it's also important to publicly support the independent judges that are still working in El Salvador, and also the independent civil society groups when they are attacked or threatened for upholding the law. Clearly, there are no easy solutions when confronting this scenario. It requires a concerted effort by national civil society with the assistance of the international community. And myself and also DPLF recognized the pain of the victims of violence in El Salvador, as well as the victims of state-perpetrated violence. Now, however, as difficult as this may be, Mr. Chairman, it is our position and the position of DPLF that the Foundation for Justice and Crime Reduction in El Salvador going forward rests on the absolute respect for the human rights. Thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bullock.
Good morning, honorable members of the commission, and good morning to my fellow panelists. At the outset of the state of exception, Crystal Sal, our organization, created an online platform where family members of victims of human rights violations could register complaints and request assistance. My testimony today is based on 2,698 complaints presented to Crystal Sal involving 2,799 individuals. Crystal Sal has documented and verified these cases through in-depth interviews with family members, former prisoners, and corroborating secondary sources and field visits. Since the beginning of our monitoring, Crystal Sal has received complaints from relatives of roughly 1 in every 20 person detained during the state of exception. Official public information on the implementation of the state of exception has been mostly limited to government publicity reported on social media platforms, while public information requests made by Crystal Sal have been for the most part denied. It is also difficult to obtain firsthand information from inside the prisons, as relatives of detainees, their legal representatives of humanitarian organizations do not have access to detainees. It is also important to note that data gathering in communities targeted by authorities under the state of exception has been inhibited by an environment of fear and distrust, and de facto and legal restrictions on the exercise of free speech, freedom of association, and free circulation. Recently, Crystal Sal was informed by relatives of people detained under the state of exception that they were warned by authorities that they would suffer reprisals for speaking to human rights organizations, mentioning specifically Crystal Sal. The 2,698 complaints that Crystal Sal has documented represents a body of evidence sufficient to establish clear patterns of systematic and widespread violations of human rights being perpetrated in El Salvador under the state of exception. The abuses include the practice of mass arbitrary detentions, due process violations, torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment against tens of thousands of Salvadoran citizens that have caused the deaths of at least 76 individuals in custody of the state. Many of these deaths have shown signs of physical abuse characteristic of extrajudicial killings. To date, the Attorney General's office has not opened investigations on any of the deaths of Salvadorans in state custody. During the state of exception, Crystal Sal has prioritized giving legal defense to detainees with chronic illnesses or disabilities. The experience has demonstrated that exercising the legal defense of Salvadoran accused of crimes under the state of exception is all but impossible. There is no registration systems for persons detained during the state of exception, which prevents families from knowing which prison detainees are in, forcing them to look for them in all prisons. Relatives do not receive information on the date of the arraignment hearings from either the court or the public defender's office. All people detained under the state of exceptions are prosecuted en masse. Crystal Sal's attorneys have been present in arraignment hearings of 200 to 600 individuals in which the accused are not actually present in court. The Attorney General presents the request for pretrial detention of 6 months without even presenting individualized evidence against the accused. All judicial proceedings are private at the request of the Attorney General. The judicial processes are carried out by specialized tribunals for organized crimes, where judges have been recently appointed to preside over these cases, and their identities have been kept secret. The judges almost automatically order provisional detention for 6 months and generally do not make considerations for detainees with disabilities, chronic health issues, or serious disease. The court does not give equal participation to the parties, and Crystal Sal's attorneys have not been able to present evidence of innocence during any of the hearings. According to the accounts of former prisoners, the tens of thousands of people detained during the emergency regime find themselves in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, suffering deprivation or restriction of food, water, and medicines, or other necessities. And specific complaints have been received about collective torture against people deprived of their liberty in El Salco and La Esperanza, or Mariona prison, through the constant beatings, threats, and the application of pepper spray and being forced to stand in positions for hours. In one emblematic case, members of the armed forces arrived at a family-run restaurant in San Salvador on April 13, 2022, and arrested a mother of 3, along with her 33-year-old daughter and 36-year-old son. Although there was no arrest warrant, a pro-government Facebook account tagged the Ministry of Justice and Security, alleging that the business owners were gang members. On May 12th, employees of a funeral home arrived at the family's home in San Salvador to inform the family that the son had died in Mariona prison from a pulmonary edema. No autopsy was performed. The family and the man had no previous illness before he died in state custody. In another case, Salvadoran police arrested a 40-year-old father with type 2 diabetes on April 18, 2022. He was taken to the local police station to verify his identity and later charged with illicit association under the state of exception. A month later, he died after being admitted to the hospital. The cause of death, according to the hospital's death certificate, was septic shock related to a gangrenous right lower limb which had been previously amputated, and type 2 diabetes mellitus. The family was informed of the death by employees of a funeral home who came to the house to offer their services. The authorities gave no explanation to the family as to the causes of his death. For fear of reprisal, the family is not willing to file a complaint with the Attorney General. Billboards in San Salvador encourage citizens to report terrorists in their neighborhood to the authorities. Internationally, the Salvadoran government frames and legitimizes the state of exception, its excessive restrictions of rights and abuses, based on misguided precedents set in the context of the global war on terror. Crystal Sal and our partners have denounced the state of exception as unconstitutional, morally wrong, and from a citizen security policy perspective, a misguided repetition of repressive and punitive policy failures from the past. History has shown in El Salvador and around the globe that state violence and human rights violations rarely produce lasting peace, rather seed and perpetuate new cycles of violence and inequality. The state of exception may have popular support in the short term, but over time will extract political, social, and economic costs on Salvadoran society, disproportionately affecting the poorest communities in the country. The state of exception threatens the very democratic institutions and norms that protect fundamental freedoms and democracy for all Salvadorans, and set dangerous precedents that undermine inter-American and international human rights standards in the region. In El Salvador, the current situation demands urgent action to end the state of exception and the systematic violation of rights, to restore judicial independence, to build accountability for abuses of power, and implement consistent, transparent, and vigorous law enforcement within the framework of the law. The United States and its Salvadoran counterparts should mobilize international and civil society cooperation to implement peace-building approaches and rehabilitation and reintegration programs to dismantle the structures of organized crime and social violence. I submit this testimony to the Commission today as a reminder of the words enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Honorable members of this Commission, human rights are not an obstacle for peace and security. They are indeed the very foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hector Silva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Honorable Commission. Uh, Good afternoon. The state of exception in El Salvador was decreed following a public security emergency that is the direct responsibility of the government of President Nayib Bukele. The government imposed this state of exception in an attempt to remedy a problem it had itself created, which was the spike in violence last March following the breakdown of the pact the Bukele administration had with the MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs. President Bukele has tried to claim that this pact does not exist and that it is an invention of investigative journalism in El Salvador. However, this pact has been confirmed by Salvadoran prosecutors who are now in exile and by US agents whose input landed two high Salvadoran government officials with designations by the Treasury Department on the sanctions provided by the Magnitsky Act. Salvadoran gangs, which, as you know, were born in the streets of Los Angeles and became sophisticated in Central America prisons, are a complex phenomenon with two dimensions, one criminal and the other social. The second, the social dimension, has to do with the conditions of marginality, poverty, and hopelessness in which thousands of young Salvadorans live. These conditions were not born with Bukele, nor are they his fault. But his government, like those that preceded him, has been totally inefficient when it comes to finding solutions to this marginality. Those solutions are not found in a state of exception. The other dimension, the criminal one, continues to grow. Salvadoran gangs, although they no longer kill as they used to, continue to extort and disappear those who get in their way. In addition, in some areas of the country, such as the West, cliques or cells of the gangs that the government has favored have increased their capacity to work in drug trafficking. None of these has been solved either by the state of exception. The breakdown of the pact between the Bukele government and the gangs, which motivated the decree of state of exception in the first place, showed that the territorial control plan, as the president had labeled his public security policy, had failed. Bukele needed a plan B to distract attention from that failure and in the process, limit the rights of Salvadorans, including the freedom of expression. When he decreed the regime of exception, President Bukele already controlled the entire state apparatus. Today, he has, in addition, an extra instrument to intimidate those who go against his narrative. A Salvadoran woman, herself a critic of government abuses, and one of the dozens of citizens whose phones have been spied on with Pegasus, told me, quote, "The exception regime is like a gun on the table. They are not pointing it at you, but you know that at any moment they can grab it and shoot you," unquote. And what is happening in this regime of exception? It so happens that the National Civilian Police sets up massive raids without little to no previous investigation. And then the Attorney General's office follows up with accusations that, in many cases, have very little factual evidence beyond stigmatization. And it happens that because of the absolute control that the government exercises over the courts and the prosecutor's office, preventive detention is indefinite. And it happens that in prisons, there are no minimum guarantees that the rights of the accused without evidence are respected. Dozens of families have denounced that their relatives have been tortured in the prison system of El Salvador, that their ribs have been broken, that they have been made to bleed from blows, or that they have been left to die without medicines that they needed to treat chronic illnesses. It is also important to mention that new reforms approved by the president's party allow the PNC, the police, to arrest citizens with anonymous tips as their only backup. Salvadorans are one call away from sleeping in a prison cell. All of this has happened before in El Salvador, in Latin America, and in the world. In our region, we have known it as dictatorships. In Europe, it has been called fascism. Honorable Congressman, one of the less visible consequences of the regime of exception is the exile of government critics, including journalists, which adds to a similar trend that plagues other countries with authoritarian governments in the region, such as Guatemala or Nicaragua. While this hearing is taking place, one of the most respected academics on public security and gang issues is fleeing El Salvador because the National Civilian Police has opened a spurious case against him, which will most likely become a criminal case in the Attorney General's office. He's one of many who have had to flee after investigating Bukele's government and its gang negotiations. Honorable Co-Chairman McGovern, you knew firsthand the hope that the 1992 peace accords, as you told us today, brought to El Salvador. You were in our country. You helped us a lot in that process. The PNC was one of those promises. Today, that police force is mostly a repressive arm. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak before you and to explain to this honorable commission the situation that my country lives under the Bukele regime. What I have shared with you today is neither an accident nor a passing evil. We're talking about a president and a regime that seeks to accumulate power and perpetuate itself in it. How many times did we see that movie in Latin America? How many times did we count the victims that these anti-democratic regimes provoked in our countries? How many times did we fail to understand the magnitude of the abyss we were facing? This abyss is dark, and this is the time to do whatever is necessary to avoid falling into it. Before I take my leave, if I may, Honorable Commission, I leave you with the words of a Salvadorans whom Congressman McGovern knew well, those of Father Ignacio Yacuria. The search for a critical thinking that seeks to transform reality, said the Jesuit priest, quote, requires great honesty, a claim to maximum autonomy and freedom, and it requires, finally, great courage in a country where the weapons of death explode all too often in the most threatening proximity. Unquote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tarsiuk Rana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am honored to appear before this commission to discuss the human rights situation in El Salvador during the country's state of emergency. Gang violence in El Salvador is a very serious problem, and the government has the responsibility to take serious and rights-respecting steps to protect the population and to hold gang members to account. But instead of protecting Salvadorans, this broad state of emergency has been a recipe for disaster. We have documented widespread human rights violations committed during the state of emergency, including massive arbitrary detentions, short-term disappearances, enforced disappearances, due process violations, and ill-treatment of detainees. Police and soldiers have conducted dozens of raids, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, arresting tens of thousands of people across El Salvador's 14 departments. Authorities report that over 51,000 people have been detained, including 1,600 children. According to our interviews with relatives of detainees and witnesses, many arrests appear to be based on people's physical appearance and on the fact that they live in low-income neighborhoods where gangs operate. We documented 7 cases where people with mental health conditions were arrested and are accused of being gang members. In over 120 cases documented by Human Rights Watch, people were taken from their homes or picked up on the street without being shown a search or an arrest warrant by security forces. Detainees were rarely informed of the reasons of their arrest, and in several cases, officers refused to provide information about the detainees' whereabouts to their families, and this amounts to an enforced disappearance under international law. Many of them were held incommunicado for weeks or for months and were only allowed to see their lawyers for just a few minutes before their pretrial detention hearings. As my colleagues have said, over 70 people detained during the state of emergency have reportedly died in custody. Authorities failed to meaningfully investigate these deaths, and in some cases, detainees who died in prison had illnesses, and authorities did not provide them with the medication that they needed. The massive imprisonment during the state of emergency significantly increased El Salvador's prison population. Currently, overcrowding is so extreme that detainees barely have space to move. 4 people who were detained in different detention facilities under the state of emergency and were later released told us that in our research. Historically, poor prison conditions such as overcrowding, violence, and poor access to basic services such as food and drinking water appear to have seriously deteriorated in the context of the state of emergency. Authorities repeatedly infringed due process guarantees established under international law, violating detainees' human rights and making it difficult, if not impossible, for them to adequately defend themselves during criminal proceedings. over 40,000 people have been arrested for the crime of illicit association, which under Salvadoran law carries a range of legal consequences that could run counter international human rights law, including mandatory pretrial detention and extremely harsh penalties of up to 45 years that could amount to disproportionate punishment. Hearings have been conducted in groups, sometimes as many as 400 people at a time, which makes it difficult for judges, prosecutors, and detainees' lawyers to assess the evidence and the arguments concerning each individual detainee. High-level authorities, including President Bukele, have consistently excused or tried to justify human rights violations as supposedly acceptable errors that are committed in what they call a war against gangs. President Bukele has also signaled that security forces will be shielded from accountability if they engage in abuses, and he has called anyone who criticizes his government's measures a gang defender. These widespread human rights violations have been enabled by President Bukele's destruction of the rule of law, including of judicial independence, since he took office in 2019. The dismantling of the rule of law in El Salvador is consistent with a troubling regional trend. In addition to the full-fledged dictatorships in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we are extremely concerned by the situation in countries where democratically elected leaders, like Mr. Bukele, once in power, turn their back on basic democratic guarantees, such as judicial independence, the independent press, and civil society. This authoritarian playbook is followed by Latin American leaders along the ideological spectrum. This should serve as an alarming reminder for the US Congress and the Biden administration to prioritize protecting the rule of law in the Americas. The United States has taken some important steps to defend the rule of law in Central America, including freezing assets and suspending visas of individuals who have been implicated in corruption and in human rights violations. USAID has also redirected assistance away from the National Police and the Institute for Access to Public Information in El Salvador towards civil society and human rights groups. Much more should be done. The United States should send a clear-cut message that it will not be an ally to governments that do not respect judicial independence, and that continuing attacks on the courts and widespread human rights violations as those being committed in El Salvador will carry consequences, including, if necessary, the suspension of military aid. It also needs to do more to rally multilateral pressure, starting with like-minded governments in Latin America, to encourage increased oversight mechanisms for existing and new loans so that they contribute to protecting human rights. US officials, including at senior levels, should publicly call out abuses like the ones I've described when they occur. Leaders across Latin America who break the rule of law for their own gain need to know that the United States is watching. We all need to stand with the Salvadoran people today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate all of your statements. And let me ask Ms. Arteaga, I just want to confirm what you were saying in your opening statement, that the previous constitutional court would not have found the state of exception to be legal. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct, Congressman McGovern. Yes. Several years ago, the previous constitutional chamber on a different statement interpreted that the Article 29 of the Salvadorian Constitutional Court does not include a race of crime as a ground for declaring a state of emergency. Yes, and also the previous constitutional chamber, before being fired by Bukele controlled General Assembly, also ruled that the that any state of emergency should not suspend judicial guarantees. So in several opportunities, the constitutional jurisprudence has been very clear in El Salvador that a state of emergency cannot be applied when there's just a regular or even an extraordinary rise on crime, and also judicial guarantees cannot be suspended under any circumstance.
And just in case somebody's just watching this and doesn't really have a understanding of recent Salvadoran history, can you just explain what happened to the previous constitutional court?
Yes, and the current General Assembly that began on June 2019, June 2020, that is now controlled by the political party of Bukele. The first day that they took office, basically fired the 5 magistrates of the Constitutional Court without due process, and at the same time they also fired the then Attorney General. And then they elected without any due process new members of the Constitutional Court that are not people that have all the legal requirements and are very loyal to the current Bukele administration.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock, is there anything the United States government, perhaps the embassy specifically, could do to support documentation of rights violations under the state of exception?
Well, I think that it's a bit complicated. What we're lacking right now is access to public information. Remember that the Institute for Public Information, which was previously one of the great achievements in establishing internal controls within the government and guaranteeing access to the population to public information, has also suffered serious setbacks in terms of independence and acting. So the majority of public information requests are not being granted. And much of the public information, including about public administration, has been reserved for up to 7 years. So there's a tremendous opacity of the public administration right now, and that's one of our barriers. Also, I think it would be useful for an international commission to be able to see the situation, observe the situation inside the prisons. The Human Rights Ombudsman has done highly produced inspections of the prisons, but from what we can see from the photographs, not in the sections of the prisons where we understand detainees under the state of exception to being held. So I think some independent verification of the prison situation could be useful, but I think it is a difficult situation.
Are there cases being prepared to take before the Inter-American Human Rights system at all, or?
Yes, there are. The strategy is to first use the national system. And so partially we need to be able to accompany cases through the judicial process here in El Salvador, but there will be cases presented to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission.
Mr. Silva, according to academic expert Michael Paulberg, El Salvador, quote, is emerging as a new version of the narco state, a gang state in which organized crime and authoritarian rule go hand in hand, end quote. What is your assessment of the statement? And if you agree, how does this reality affect the current state of exception and human rights abuses?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Congressman McGovern, for all your commitment with El Salvador and for hosting this hearing. Yes, I agree with what Michael Paulberg says. I think we are, as I said in the testimony, we are under a situation in which the Bukele administration has created this reality or this narrative in which He claims that he's combating gangs, but I find that to be inaccurate. It's not happening. For what all that has been said here, this state of exception targets basically poor youth in poor Salvadoran neighborhoods. And the rights of these Salvadorans have been highly damaged, as it has been stated here by my fellow panelists. While that is happening, the actual perpetrators of the whole gang criminal scheme, which are gang leadership, are protected by the administration. As U.S. investigations and and Salvadoran investigations under the previous Attorney General's office has showed us. The U.S. Government knows this. U.S. agencies know this so far as to sanction Bukele's officials that have been engaged with gang leaderships. As I said, gangs have two dimensions, one social, and that dimension is the one that's on the play under the state of regime. The criminal face of this criminal organization that is the gang is untouched. Because of the simple fact that the Bukele administration had a pact with that leadership. Another evidence of that is that the Bukele administration and also the judiciary has denied the United States the extradition of some of these gang leaders. So I fear that the statement that you quoted is accurate. And I fear, and as I said in my testimony, we would now have information that some cliques or cells of the gangs are being favored, and then some of those cliques are engaged in drug trafficking. So under the bail of the regime of exception and under the situation of this massive violation of human rights, what's happening underground is just, I fear, the creation of a criminal state.
And you, in your opening statement, you mentioned the journalist who fled El Salvador. Is there more you can say about who these journalists are who are leaving the country and the reasons that they decide to leave the country? And what is the most effective way the United States government can support at-risk journalists and the media in general?
Yes, I cannot speak of individual cases because I don't have the permission of these journalists to talk about their names. But what I can say is that friends of mine, colleagues of mine, with whom I have worked for 25 years reporting in El Salvador, in our country, now they are out of El Salvador because, as it has been stated here, it is dangerous. It is dangerous to report on what's happening in my country. The Bukele administration claims that El Salvador is not Nicaragua because no Salvadoran journalist has been imprisoned yet. That yet is a big one because we understand, I know myself, that criminal cases are being put together by this non-independent Attorney General's office against journalists. They have used the Ministry of Finance to go after journalists. The president himself stated in a press conference last year that the government had opened an investigation for money laundering against Alfaro. And for all we know, these are spurious allegations. So it's really hard to report in this environment. Lives of people are threatened. The freedom of people, the liberty of people are threatened. I don't have any repair to say that we are, as a Nicaraguan colleague has told me and others, we are rapidly deteriorating into what the Nicaraguans have seen for years. What took Daniel Ortega decades to build in Nicaragua is taking Nayib Bukele just a couple of years to build. I think that in that regard, the first step is to acknowledge the situation. I've heard in dismay U.S. officials and others saying that the situation of journalists is not as bad. It's not as bad as in Nicaragua, yes, but that's just because there's still a line that the Bukele administration hasn't there to cross yet. And that's because my take is international negotiations with multilateral institutions are taking place. And I think that the Bukele administration understands that an imprisoned journalist would look really bad in the midst of those negotiations.
Ms. Tarasiak Rana, you mentioned in your testimony that the United States should rally multilateral pressure, starting with like-minded governments in Latin America, to encourage increased oversight mechanisms for existing and new loans so they contribute to protecting human rights. Can you just tell us, what opportunities do you see for this, and what governments should the United States approach?
Thank you, Congressman McGovern. I think it's very important for Latin America more generally to pay attention to what is happening in El Salvador. Unfortunately, despite everything that has been said here today, it is not a top priority when people talk about issues of concern for human rights in the region. And it's important to find inflection points and how to influence the government of Nayib Bukele. And as Mr. Silva was saying, it's not easy. And money is what is keeping him afloat. So the key challenge here is not to condition aid that helps the Salvadoran people, but ensuring that there is accountability in the way the money is spent and that the money is not given directly to abusive security forces is essential. And that, as Mr. Bullock was saying, that there is transparency in the way the funds are being spent. In this sense, I think it's important to continue monitoring the IMF loans to El Salvador, and in particular to look at funding that is getting to El Salvador through regional banks and cooperation in Central America.
Thank you. I have a few questions that anyone has an answer to, they just raise their hand, but I think any of you can answer it, and then I'll give you an opportunity to all make one final statement. But what's known about the mass graves that have been discovered since 2019? The government says that the murder rate is down due to the measures it's implemented. Are murders being replaced by disappearances? If anyone wants to answer, just raise your hand and I'll. Yeah, Mr. Bullock. And Ms. Arteaga, yeah, we'll give. So no, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. I think it is one of we need to look at other indicators of crime to understand or evaluate the effectiveness of the state of exception. So you mentioned forced disappearances, and extortion would be another one. As a human rights organization, we provide direct assistance to people internally displaced by gang violence. And so it's worth mentioning that during the state of exception, we have seen a drop in new cases, but not an absolute end to it. We have had over 120 individuals seek assistance, having been internally displaced by gang violence. So you can see that the structures of the criminal organizations haven't disappeared, and they find new forms to operate and mutate in their modus operandi. And so forced disappearances at one period during the Bukele's territorial control policy was a new manifestation of violence. And I think that it's important to understand too that when people flee violence, gang violence, it means that the individuals believe two things about their circumstances. One, that the criminal organizations that persecute them have the capacity to do great harm to them. And two, that the state is fundamentally unable or unwilling to protect them. So I think that is one of the things that we need to continue to monitor and evaluate about the effectiveness of using massive human rights violations to supposedly suppress organized criminal groups. In as much as the investigations about the mass graves that you mentioned, there hasn't been a lot of transparency about those processes going forward. We don't have any knowledge of who is specifically responsible, for example, for the more recent one that was found in the municipality of Nueva Cuscatlán. And so those are some of the concerns that we have in terms of law enforcement and the will of the government to investigate and hold people accountable for these large and serious crimes. I think it's also worth mentioning that when it comes to families of disappeared people, they have made efforts to organize, to demand effective investigations of the crimes. And in response to that, high-level officials, including the Minister of Justice and Security, has attacked them and even tried to stigmatize them as liars or their children as criminals, or that the parents of being responsible for not better supervising their children. So that is the context. Just one more thing I'd like to say about the broader impacts of the state of exception policy is that I think we need to continue to monitor how it changes the political society. We see that in communities, people don't talk to each other. There's not trust to share their experiences. Families whose relatives have been detained under the state of exception are not receiving support from the community members, even if the children or relatives are well known not to be part of the criminal structures. And that's a consequence of an environment of fear, a reluctance to get involved with people who have been targets of state repression. And that's something that I think over time will continue to erode social cohesion. We have heard phrases from community leaders such as community organization is persecuted in this context. We see a drop in participation in cooperatives and community organizations and other civic groups as a fear for future repression. And I'll close with this. Of the cases that we've documented, 416 have said specifically that other family members have suffered additional forms of intimidation or violence. And 112 of those families said that they were threatened specifically with additional detentions if they report what's happening to them. And of those 112 cases, we've been able to document 68 cases in which family members have been detained as a reprisal. So it's important to see how the state of exception becomes the norm and undermines not only the democratic institutions of the country, but the democratic and social fabric, political culture of the country.
Lenore, you had your hand up. We'll go to you.
Mass graves have been a huge issue in El Salvador for the last, I don't know, several years. Previously from the state of emergency, but one thing is that there's little public information about who is in charge of investigating and identifying the remains of those grave of those bodies. And as part of this scenario of the state of emergency, the National Forensic Institute in El Salvador has also been militarized. And now what is supposed to be a scientific investigation, forensic investigation, is now also being controlled by the current government. So nobody really knows what's going on after a mass grave is discovered. And also some independent research tell us that mass graves are a sign of how the crime is evolving from very clear homicides to more what we can call it more enforced disappearances. At least the bodies are being hidden with more in a more sophisticated way. So it's important to pay more attention to mass graves in El Salvador, because I think it's taken a huge dimension as we have seen in Mexico in previous years.
Thank you. So let me go. Let me ask this next question of Hector and Tamara. I mean, the Salvadoran embassy, I may provide a statement for this hearing, and they haven't yet, but I think they indicated they might. And however, what they told us was that the victims of gang violence support overwhelmingly the government's policies. And so, how do you respond to that assertion? And and under international law, does the government bear any responsibility for persistent gang violence?
Maybe I can take that first, and Hector can complement. The government of El Salvador has a responsibility to provide security, but it isn't allowed to do it at any cost. I think that's the first point. And what they're doing is not actually providing an accurate and rights-respecting security policy. If you want to seriously address gang violence, you need an effective security strategy to dismantle these criminal groups. You need to create new jobs for marginalized young people. They have to participate fully in society. You need rehabilitation programs. The government has to train police and prosecutors so that they enforce the law. You need to root out police corruption and end excessive use of force so that people start trusting the justice system instead of being afraid of it. So the last part of your, that's an answer to the last part of your question. And in terms of, the popular support, President Bukele is extremely popular inside the country. And what I would tell to the people the embassy will talk to with that statement saying that what they're doing is providing security to the people is, if it hasn't happened to anyone, it may be easy to ignore the arbitrary detentions, the rights violations that we have been talking about in this hearing regarding the state of emergency. But in democracies, you need to set limits to reflect these universally accepted rights and obligations, because otherwise anything is permitted. And, in a context when you don't have any government institutions that can act as a check on executive power, the truth is that anyone can wake up and be the target of government repression and of possible criminal prosecution. So we can't be normalizing living without rights in El Salvador, because that ends up being dangerous for everyone. So what I would tell someone who wants to justify what they're doing today as a public security response to gang violence is, of course, gang violence has left deep scars in Salvadoran society, and it generates the obligation to respond, but not like this. This is not permitted under international law, and it does generate international responsibility for those who are implementing these policies.
Hector? You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Well, you said it yourself at your opening statement, Congressman McGovern. Something that's popular doesn't mean that it's right. That's one thing. The other thing is that we don't have any way to know whether this is popular or not. We know about polling that say that polling that has been produced and published by the government, that these measures are popular. Other polling by, for instance, the University of Central America have agreed with that in general, some measures are popular, but with a lot of nuance. Like when you ask within the communities when you ask other questions about how secure they feel, it's not that popular, because I think that has to do with what Tamara just said, which is not a state of security, it's a state of fear. To use what the word that Noah just used. What you're living in El Salvador is a state of fear. It's like what you have experienced, but we known that has happened in other countries under dictatorships. An apparent tranquility that hides a state of fear. That's what we're seeing in El Salvador. And I think that, I mean, how could you trust a poll in a country in which people, as Noah just told us, are afraid to speak the truth? People are afraid to talk to the neighbor because they don't know who they're talking to. You also said it yourself. People are scared to talk to a U.S. congressman because they could be seen as enemies of the regime. People are, of course, scared of talking to journalists. So there is no way to know how popular this is. But then again, I end with this idea: popular is not right necessarily.
Noah, did you have your hand up?
I apologize. I had it up from
Oh,
before.
okay. Let me ask my final questions, and then you all can answer whatever you want to answer, and then if there's anything else you want to add, you can add, but I just want to get these out. I mean, has the government done anything to address the concerns of the victims, who've disappeared, or, in terms of trying to find accountability, or if people felt that their loved one was taken unjustly? I mean, has there anything been done to try to get to the truth, or to satisfy families who feel that their son or daughter or father or mother were taken unjustly? The other thing is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has issued recommendations for combating organized crime consistent with human rights. I mean, is any of that relevant to El Salvador? And is there any other country out there or experience that El Salvador could look to, for a better model? Because look, at the end of the day, I mean, gang violence is out of control. It's real, and it contributes to everybody feeling a sense of insecurity. So I think we're all in agreement that we need to figure out a way everybody should figure out a way to control the violence and to provide protection. But is there a model out there? And then, as you answer that, and then you go into your final, statement here, you might want to address the question of how can we in Congress be best helpful in all of this, in terms of supporting legitimate efforts to combat gang violence, but also in a way that doesn't just blow up democracy. And I should just say this for, Hector mentioned polling, but there's also trolling, right? Usually, I'm sure, anytime you mention El Salvador, there's this, the allies close to the government come out and they all issue kind of the same kind of type of statements. I get that, that people can respond any way they want to respond. But no one here is saying that gang violence isn't a real problem, and isn't an incredibly serious problem. But what we're saying is you got to do that consistent, with the rule of law, and consistent with democratic principles, because what's popular today, may not be so popular tomorrow when they come knocking on your door, when it's your son or your daughter. What's popular today may not be so popular tomorrow. If somebody that you know and you care about is swept up in a raid, who is innocent, and then disappears or is found in a mass grave. So, I mean, as I said in the beginning, and Hector, thanks for repeating it. I mean, popular is not necessarily right. And I'm also just say one final thing here as well. Look, the United States isn't perfect. And so when people say, "Oh, you have lots of things that you can point to that are not, that are problematic," and democracy has experienced some backsliding in the United States, or don't talk to us about human rights. Look at Guantanamo. Bottom line is, I think all of us on this and at this hearing today all condemn human rights violations wherever they may occur, whether they're in democracies or whether they're in autocracies. I mean, a human rights violation is a human rights violation. But as people who care about human rights, we have an obligation, no matter where they may occur, to raise our voices. And again, so anyway, let me, that's a lot. I just threw at everybody, but let's just kind of go down the list here, and then if you have anything else you want to say, this is the time to say it. So whoever wants to go first can go first.
Okay, if I may, sorry.
Okay, Hector.
Sorry. Okay, well, just as a final participation in front of the commission, I think there are some models that could be studied and put in place, or at least gather information on how those work. We have, I mean, you have here close by to Congress one of those models. That's the model of how Montgomery County, Maryland, faced this gang violence back in the early 2000s, on the mid 2000s. Montgomery County had a really important gang problem in its hands. And they did three things, basically. They pay attention to working with the community to build trust between the community, mostly a Latino community, mostly a Salvadoran community, trust between that community and the county government and its branches, including the police. That allowed the police, for a second thing, the authorities, to have actionable, reliable intelligence to go after the leadership of these criminal organizations, while respecting the social dimension of this. Montgomery County authorities were able to target the criminal aspect of this because the community trusted them in a general manner. So yes, they addressed the criminal problem without disrespecting the human rights of the community which lived and suffered the gang violence. So yes, you have this. But the third key to this is the Montgomery County authorities weren't allowed to work in darkness. There was a lot of accountability set up with these programs. Financial accountability. Where is the county using the money that either the state government or the federal government is giving them to face this problem? Accountability. So those are things that we lack in El Salvador. Any solution first has to go to this dual dimension of the problem, and then it cannot work without transparency. And that leads me to one last thing I would like to use the opportunity to say. I really like this idea that Noah Bullock put in the table of asking the Salvadoran government, have the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, and the international community in general, asking the Salvadoran government to allow some sort of international commission to go to El Salvador and actually understand what's happening, actually go to the jails, actually go to the communities, talk to people. That is already difficult, again, because we're living in a state of fear. But if an international community is allowed to visit the jails, not to take pictures in a couple of places of jails, which are, not the places in which the tortures are happening. If an international committee is allowed to go and have interviews open to the public with the Attorney General's office so he can explain what's happening with mass graves and disappearances, that might put some truth to it, some transparency to it. Because again, and I finish with this, no policy, if we're living or trying to live in a democracy, works without transparency.
Thank you. Thank you. Leonora?
Oh, definitely taking into account the community level is very important, and probably Crystal Sal and other local human rights organizations that have been working with community can illustrate us more about that. But on my end, I think that it's time to begin debating in El Salvador the idea that international crimes are being committed. And that means that El Salvador needs an extraordinary mechanism coming from the United Nations or probably from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to investigate this period of time in order to have documentation from an international body and at the same time to think of international justice avenues. This is not going to happen, not today, but in the future. It's important that current officers in El Salvador have this idea that at some point they will be held accountable, as we have seen in the history of Latin America. So it's important of course, to still work to strengthen the national justice system, but at the same time to work on international avenues for justice and accountability. And I also think that it's important from the Congress side and also the State of Department to give more attention on what is happening within the Attorney General office. I think the Attorney General office is now the key to for this whole scenario of arbitrary detentions, and so it's important to pay more attention on what's going on, and even probably going after sanctions for the Attorney General or and the close team of the current Attorney General. Thank you.
Tamara?
Thanks. I'll be brief just to complement what has been said. I think the key.
Hey, Noah, why don't we go to you and then we'll wait till see if we get her back, okay?
Okay, thank you, Congressman. I'll try and address some of your questions. One, in terms of relief for victims, the Salvadoran government has said that they have released a little over 600 individuals who were captured during the state of exception. It's been difficult for us to monitor or document the causes or what the process to determine that those people should be released. But we have direct knowledge of 4 cases. In one case, we know for sure that it was a case that received significant public pressure, and subsequently one of the family members or 2 family members were released. There were 3 family members who were detained. And then the other 3 cases, to the best of our ability, seem to be cases that appeal to political connections for their family members to become released. And what both of those circumstances indicate is abnormal processes for releasing people accused of crimes or a politicization of the justice system itself. In terms of international experiences that we could draw from, I think that obviously, and this in regard to popularity too, human rights standards are not ideological standards, they're not political positions, they're derived from historic experience from the past. And so I think that we have lots, that's what, when we draw on those historic experiences from the past, where we see judiciaries crumble, mass human rights violations to be justified for the security of the population, the power concentrated in the hands of few, these patterns are concerning, and that's why, independently of popularity, it's worthwhile to denounce them. The second one is that, I think Leonor mentioned it, is that we've looked a lot at the Fujimori experience in Peru. And one of the things that was done in that experience was the creation of a commission, I believe it was led by the church, that reviewed cases and made recommendations about people who should be given basically pardons. We think that that model may not be adequate for our situation, unless it was an international commission with absolute independence that could act with a lot of legitimacy to look at all the cases. Otherwise, the commissions of this nature could be used to justify or legitimize the strategy and not provide sufficient relief to the thousands of people who were unfairly detained. The other thing I think is important when we assess the use of emergency powers is that internationally we kind of use three principles to assess the validity of it independently of the constitutional criteria that Leonor mentioned. And one is obviously the legality, that it's done within the framework of the law and international standards and people understand the consequences of their actions. Two, proportionality, that means that the actions are not more damaging than the problem they're trying to solve, but necessity. And I think necessity understood is that there's no other less damaging option. And that's one of the problems here in the debate in El Salvador is there's this false binary option that it's either let the terrorists run loose or commit massive violations of human rights. And that's just not the case. There have always been alternatives, and there are alternatives. If there were evidence to round up 50,000 people prior to this, why didn't that get done through the framework of the law and using trials over the real power of the justice system during the first 3 years of the administration? So I think that we always need to keep in mind that there are alternatives and that can be something that the United States dialogues with the Salvadoran government. But I also think that we need to be able to dialogue and think through that this is a moment for transitional justice again. That there's a need for truth and justice for what the gangs, the damage that the gangs have done, but that trials with secret judges, mass trials where people don't have the right to defend them are not likely to produce real truth or justice that is capable of repairing. So I think that we need to be moving into a framework where we think again about transitional justice to repair the damage, both by what the gangs have done, but what these excessives in the security policy of the Salvadoran government have done. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk and share our experience, and look forward to being able to be part of dialogues in the future.
Thank you. I just want one more time to see whether Tamara is I think we may have lost her here. Let me thank all of you for your excellent testimony and having this discussion, which I think is really important. And I appreciate the administration's witnesses as well for being here. Look, democracies are fragile, and the notion that the only way you can fight crime is by trashing your democracy is short-sighted and dangerous, and quite frankly will lead to a future that I think most Salvadorans would not want to see. At the end of the day, the Salvadoran people have to, are the ones who are going to determine their own fate. And, and those of us here in Congress, we can urge and we can condition and we can sanction. And we will do that because I think El Salvador's democracy is worth fighting for. But this idea that, the only way you can control the gangs is by basically trashing your democracy, I think is just wrong-headed. I really do. And it's tragic that it's happening. So I think some of the suggestions that were made here today, we will follow up on. And we look forward to working with all of you in the future. And please be safe. With that, the hearing has come to an end. Thank you.